What we mean by sustainable investment is when we recognize that these things can and should be included in financial decision making. And that can be included in two separate ways. Thank you very much. There we go. So there are two different ways to look at ESG. One is, it's how do environmental, social, and governance factors impact the financial performance of that company. So it can either be a risk you can reduce, for example, inefficiencies in water, for example, or the reduced yields of agricultural products, given climate change, for example. So all of those are risks. But it can also be opportunities. We've seen, for example, the significant rise of renewable energy, right? That's an opportunity for the company for growth, financial performance, that is related to sustainability. So that's one thing, that's the financial materiality of ESG factors. The other aspect, the other side of the coin to sustainable investment is recognizing that every single economic activity, whether we want it or not, whether we're managing or not, has a positive on environment and society. And that impact can be both positive and negative. So what am I talking about? So here I'm not saying how environment and society are impacting the company. I'm saying how does the company impact its employers, its employees, so, the local community that's around their plants. How is it impacting the land that's around it? Or, for example, is it polluting rivers? So we see that there's two kinds of materiality, and we actually call this double materiality, which is how does ESG impact the company, and how does the company impact the real economy? So that is the definition of sustainable investment. There we go. Thank you. I think perhaps might be here. Sorry. So hopefully those online were able to hear me before I can actually look at this. Oh, there we go. So one of the things that you might remember if you've heard already of sustainable development is those three circles that exist, right? Social, environmental, and economic. And I would argue that that is an old way to think of sustainable development, because that doesn't necessarily recognize the interdependency between those three spheres. So here in the image, what you have is actually work done by the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. I was leading their work with global investors such as HSBC, PIMCO, etc., for them to better understand how is our investment portfolio related to environment and society. So here you have a recognition that the financial and investment, the returns of that is directly dependent on society and environment, right? You can imagine, for example, if there are resources such as water or such as rare earth minerals that start decreasing in their availability, Coca-Cola's product is going to become more expensive, or they have to reduce their margins, for example, if there's less water. Batteries using a lot of rare earth minerals, they're going to become more expensive, or we're going to have less of them if we use too much rare earth minerals and don't find alternatives for that. So these interdependencies is what truly defines sustainable investment. So in a sense, it's not necessarily about doing good. Obviously, there's an aspect of that, but it's really understanding what is core in terms of these dependencies for the functioning of my corporation, of my financial institution. And the other aspect that revolves around this as well, which is on the impact side, is the recognition that the way that we invest indirectly impacts our GDP. What do I mean by that? If we are steering capital to activities that result in high carbon emissions, that results in increased climate change. And by increased climate change, there are a significant amount of studies out there showing that climate change, the increase of climate change, is impacting GDP growth because of increased floods, increased droughts, sea level rises. I used to work in the UK when I worked for Cambridge, and at the time, it's probably around 7 years ago, the Financial Times headlines was, "We are now having the first climate migrants of the UK." There were certain villages in Wales that the houses were very close to the seashore, and with sea level rises, those individuals lost their homes, right? Insurance doesn't cover it because it's an act of God. Governments can't cover it. They lost their property. What if that was your real estate portfolio? That's gone, right? So we recognize that the way we invest impacts GDP, but also impacts the assets, the corporations that you are exposed to via your portfolios. So what's driving a lot of advancements around sustainable investments? Regulation, because whether you want it or not, if you're being regulated for ESG, that's something that you have to do. And why do I believe, and I'm proposing here, is that regulation is actually only going to pick up even faster? Well, because all of these regulators over here, regulators and central banks, have come together to form something that's called Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS, for those that are a little more intimate with it. So basically, it's a high number of governments around the world that have come together to say, we as regulators understand that climate can impact financial stability. That's something that's not new. When Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of England, as chair of the Financial Stability Board, he gave a very important speech called Tragedy of the Horizons. That was about 5 years ago, where he basically said, this does impact financial stability, but our financial monetary systems do not recognize it because we work in 3-5 years. And obviously climate change, we're going to see the big impact of it further down the line, although obviously we're seeing that already. So with these governments working together, they're learning best practices, right? In general, Europe is quite advanced. What is it doing? It's sharing, all right, I did this regulation. This is the way the industry has reacted to it. This is how to polish it, so that the regulators that come after it don't start from zero. They're actually starting from 50%, 70% in terms of understanding how effectively those regulated entities, how to set up regulation that can be effective for those entities. And that's the outcome of it. That is the aggregate number of regulations specifically around sustainable finance. Europe, the last time that I went on this database, has around almost 30 regulations just around sustainable finance. If I remember correctly, the last time I checked, UAE has 3, and this is ramping up. So if it hasn't reached your country yet, it's sure about to come. These are just some cases. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm very happy to share the slides if anyone is interested. So these are just some examples of regulations. So you see that it goes certainly beyond Europe, has reached China, Korea, Singapore. So basically regulators indicating to pension funds, to asset managers, to banks, that you, at the very least, you have to start reporting on the risk that you are undertaking via your assets, via your counterparties, the climate risk. And we're talking about transition and physical risk, and I'll get to that later. But also some of the more advanced regulators are also saying it's not only about the risk that you're undertaking, but how are you contributing to a sustainable financial system, which includes reducing the amount of carbon that you're responsible for via your capital allocation. What are some of the other drivers for the increase in sustainable investments? Academic studies, lots of them. The reason why I chose these 3 is they're not studies, they're actually meta-studies. So for example, the most recent one conducted by Rockefeller Asset Management and NYU, they looked at 1,000 studies and actually identified that around 60% showed a positive relationship between ESG at a corporate level and their corporate financial performance. So these are the academics saying that the studies are, robust to say that there is a positive relationship in a company improving its actions, its risk mitigations around environment, social, and governance. One of the things that's interesting is that the number that you see here is around 60, which is similar to the other studies that you've seen here. So that's the positive findings. The negative findings are just around 10%. So that's to say that it's not 50-50, it could be very negative. It's just 10% of the studies that show the negative correlation between ESG and financial performance. And last but not least, we have client demand. This over here is a survey conducted by FactSet, and they went around the world asking wealth management clients. I don't know how many of you here work from wealth management, but around 50% of clients indicated that they are interested in their wealth manager screening or integrating ESG. So it's also a commercial driver, even in the retail space. So skip here, what are some of the ways that investors have been implementing in practice ESG? So this over here is the WEF's Global Risk Report. One of the things that's interesting is that you'll see the past more than 15 years now, but basically what they had identified in those years, starting here with 2007, are the different key risks that exist for the financial system, right? So the likelihood and the impact on your rights. So you see that these have changed drastically in the past few years from economic risks to environmental risks, right? And this is not Greenpeace, this is the World Economic Forum conducting their analysis of risk. So what several investors have started to do is try to understand what are the environmental risks that a sector or a region are exposed to, and how do I analyze the financial impact that that could have in the company, be it on the revenue, be it on the capex of the company. For example, oil and gas companies, we imagine that they will have to shift their business models, right? We'll need fossil fuel, but not as much fossil fuel, right? So we're shifting to renewable, etc. So we'll have to invest in capex, either to shift to renewables or to other things, right? We've seen Aramco, for example, become the distributor for cloud. We've seen it conduct M&A with a company that does automation of industrial processes, right? So we're seeing all of them invest. And then last but not least, OPEX, right? So be it carbon taxes that increase your operations, be it the increased cost of energy, for example, we're seeing now with Russia, but obviously quite structural issues there around climate change. So this means that they understand from a regional perspective, from a sector perspective, how is that impacting and how do we consider in our financial models? Here's just to say that at the very least, when we're looking at sustainable investment, we should consider what do we not want to invest in? And here I just wanted to highlight that ESG funds from an ethical perspective are not very different from the religious funds, right? So here's just a comparison to say that there is some overlap, which can bring the two together. There's a thematic approach as well. For example, if you're thinking of, all right, I'm going to invest in sustainable cities because I believe that the urban landscape will change. I can invest in water because it's increasingly a rare resource. So there are aspects of thematics and trying to identify, these are usually growth funds, if any of you work with growth funds, right? What are the companies that are going to ride the wave of these trends that we are seeing? And impact investing is looking at companies that have a core product that addresses social and environmental challenges while also delivering on financial performance. How am I doing on time, please? Just so that I don't run. It's okay. I'll try to wrap up quickly. Last but not least, at the end of the day, what matters? It's either the price of the equity that you're looking, or the valuation of the company. So they're actually a very robust way nowadays to consider how these ESG issues hit your DCF, right? So for example, if we're thinking of revenues, capex, opex, that would of course impact the numerator in terms of your free cash flow. When we're looking in the bottom, we're looking at required rate of return. That is impacted generally by the risk that you associate with that company, right? So generally that's volatility, beta, etc. One of the key things that with regards to ESG that does impact, and investors have been adjusting their rate of return or cost of capital, is governance. Because at the end of the day, if you have a board that is not independent, and this is not providing the correct oversight of the CEO, or for example, if you have a CEO that doesn't have the right incentives in place, right? The KPIs for their variable remuneration is not aligned with the strategy of the company, that company probably is at higher risk for you because the incentives, the oversight is not aligned with your interest as a shareholder. I will skip a few. So here's just a bit of a cheat sheet. How can you identify what is financially material for a company? So there are two questions that I'll leave you with. One is, what ESG issues can harm investors directly? So we just looked, for example, at DCF and how we can think of how issues can impact revenue, capital expenditure, and operational expenditure. And the other issue is also, how can ESG create opportunities in comparison to peers? If you think, for example, why is McDonald's all of a sudden using vegan meat, such as Beyond Meat, if you heard of that brand, in their products? It's because they believe that the consumers of junk foods will actually gradually shift. So they don't want to lose their market. So they're adapting to this new generation of millennials that want more healthy, less animal cruelty, et cetera, et cetera. So by comparing how the company that you're interested in investing is doing against its peers, you can also identify winners and losers from that perspective. Transmission channels. Again, you'll have the slides, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but here you see all of the different ways that these ESG issues can impact companies. So lower profitability, less stable, so higher volatility. For example, if you're thinking of boycotts, of reputational risk, it can have lower drawdowns, for example, in terms of equity. It can have a higher beta. And here I just have some case studies of financial institutions that were forced to have either put policies in place or reinforce their policies due to the reputational risks of some of these issues. So for example, here was HSBC that had to stop engaging with some of the corporates, had to stop offering them loans because of the associations to deforestation. And then surprise, Bank of China, who you would imagine is a great source of funding for all of the coal energy that China is still dependent on, has committed to stop financing new coal. What does that mean, right? If you've been following the Paris Agreement and climate agreements, you saw in the last COP, which is the annual meetings of countries that signed up to climate agreements, that they have collectively agreed to phase down coal. So the question is, if you're a smart investor, do you want to put new capital in an industry that has its days counted? This was so much to say. This was actually the first time ever in the history of investment that investors were public about the fact that they were boycotting an IPO. So Deliveroo, it's a bit like Talabat in Europe, if you're not familiar with that. And their workers, their writers are not considered employees. So there were 4 investors, Aviva, Legal & General, over 2 trillion of asset under management, that said publicly, first time ever that this happens, we will not invest in the IPO of Deliveroo. And if you followed the IPO of Deliveroo, the stock actually went significantly down because of this. But just to say that it is now impacting even IPOs, which had not happened before. If you want a cheat sheet of what is financially material for the sector or the company that you're covering, I highly recommend this framework. The chairman of this initiative is Michael Bloomberg. So a significant indication of how serious they are in terms of this being relevant to investors. It's called the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board, and you can access their website for free, and you just click on the sector that you're interested in, and it'll tell you some of the issues that are probably financially material for the company that you're reviewing. And happy to answer any questions either now or at the end of the meeting, as you guys prefer. Thank you very much for your attention today.
The slide showed hydrogen impact, and in 2020 it was all green at the top. Can you just elaborate on that? I mean, that indicates that everything, all the major risk categories are environmental.
Yes, absolutely.
But, I mean, does that mean all the other categories are completely disappeared? Because it was all green. So I didn't quite understand.
So if we look at 2022, geopolitics is probably quite high again. So obviously these things can change from one year to the other. If we look at the IMF, it actually stated, and those were environmental but social too. The IMF said that the two highest risks for financial growth are actually climate change and increasing income disparity, right? So it's not the fact, so actually poverty has been decreasing, fantastic. But income disparity, the fact that probably Oxfam does a study every year. I think the last statistics were the 15 people most, the most rich 15 people have the same wealth as 50% of the population, right? So that's just increasing. So just to say that these shocks to the system that are social and environmental actually impact GDP. But perhaps more directly to your question, what are some of those environmental issues, right, that are very high there?
This data, you think green is all year.
Green is environmental.
Only environmental.
Only environmental. So we're looking, for example, at that was social. That I think that was either red or purple. I don't remember off the top of my head.
There's no government. So environment.
Yes. Because if you look at climate change, that is already impacting GDP. One of the things that we are not talking about yet, but write this down, it's going to come very, very quickly, is biodiversity. The Dutch Central Bank last year conducted a study on how exposed its financial system was to decreasing rates of biodiversity, and it was around 30%. So what we have seen around 7-8 years ago of regulators doing these stress tests around physical and transition risks for the financial stability, banks are already starting to do with biodiversity. So we're already talking about biodiversity being the next climate. And actually the regulator in France, just this year, last year, integrated in the reporting of funds, how funds are mitigating biodiversity risk. That's the first government ever to pick this up. But if it's in France, it's going to get to the EU, and then it's going to get to NGFS, right? And then it's going to roll out to other countries. Apologies that I extended quite a bit in that answer. Please, sir.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's from the finance side, it's quite informative. I, being an environmental engineer, I've been working here with the Ministry of Environment. And we have been always, for major projects, there is always a necessity, it's a mandatory requirement that for the projects, environmental and social impact assessments have to be done.
Yes.
And unless those impacts are not being approved and implemented, then fundings are not being granted, even on a major projects by funding agencies, World Bank, and other associated grants. So environment and social impacts are always being addressed, but the governance parts are a little bit very weak. Because once we get the documented approved, the monitoring is certainly not being carried out as it should have been, which is also causing the impact on climate change, biodiversity, and other associated factors. So what highlight this investment part is in the governance factor, please. So
let me just paraphrase your question to be sure that I understood you correctly. Are you asking about how can investors continue to monitor the impact of projects that they fund? Or are you asking about governance in the sense of the governance of corporate governance? So how the board is, for example, independent, the remuneration of the CEO, etc. Which one of those two were you?
The first one.
The first one. Excellent. So there, one of the things that has picked up in Europe is a regulation called SFDR, so Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. So every single year, you have to report at a fund level, what's the impact of your assets in aggregate on 18 KPIs, which includes environmental and social. So for those funds, that's already covered in that sense. If we're looking at smaller companies, which generally are not listed, so they wouldn't be included under SFTR, for example. They are private equity, private credit, real estate, etc. Then it is the awareness of the investor to consider, I should be monitoring this impact because the promise that I got in the beginning obviously needs to be delivered. So that's not regulated yet, but I agree with you that that's something that investors should certainly be monitoring so that they ensure that it remains in compliance with what was agreed in the beginning. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have a question from online audience. It is Mr. Rashid Azim. I think ESG is very personalized. For example, one company is good in E, but not complying S factor. In this case, how to risk rate that company, the recommended approach?
Thank you. Excellent question, because it really speaks about the, how do we call it? The balancing act, that's not the word, but I forgot the word that I'm looking for now. The trade-offs, sorry, that's the word that the trade-offs that exist, right? So for example, when we're thinking of solar panels, excellent, right? Because they are contributing to renewable energy. But if those solar panels are being constructed in a way that has modern slavery or child labor in it, right? And when we're obtaining the minerals for them, then should we be investing in solar panels or not, right? So what we generally consider is let's focus at the product level, because at the end of the day, the product is one of the key contributions that that organization has to society, right? So let's look at the impact of the product. And then on the operation side, so we're trying to have a product that has positive impact. And then on the operation side, let's be sure that at least it reaches minimum standards, right? And then there can be an engagement as well. What do I mean by engagement? There are certain regions, communities in the world where child labor is a reality in terms of ensuring the livelihood of those families, right? Some parents can say, if my child doesn't work, we don't have enough to eat on the table. So the reality is that we can't, in my personal view, we can't say, okay, this kid doesn't work from, starting tomorrow. So how do we agree with those communities? A transition, right? So it is to say, how do we compensate those parents for the reduced income when that child goes to school? How do we include other support systems? How do we raise, so we find a solution for that community. So that's an aspect of the trade-offs that exist. Another issue is when we're looking at ESG ratings, if you have large investment, many companies in your portfolio, you're probably not doing the analysis of those companies in-house. You're probably getting ESG data providers to do that. And each ESG data provider has their own methodology in terms of the weights that they give to these two different issues, right? So the question that the gentleman asked, it's, do you give more importance to the environmental issue or to the social issue? And that goes back to the materiality. Which one is more material for the company? So which one can either make or break the company in a bigger way? But I completely agree that it is highly subjective, right? You should be able to defend it and argue why one has a greater weight than the other, but these things certainly remain highly subjective. Shall I read the next question? Okay. So the question is, well, you can read it here, but would you please highlight the opportunities arising due to ESG? Excellent question, because it's not just about the risks, right? It's about the opportunities. And hopefully I touched upon that when I described the thematic funds, right? So what are thematic funds? We look at sustainability megatrends, right? So we talked about nearly all governments agreeing to reduce carbon emissions. We talked about millennials looking for healthy foods, no animal cruelty, etc. So we try to see how is society changing because we're heading towards a more sustainable development, right? And then you look at what are the companies, and not just the company that is the, the large company that's going to sell, for example, to the ultimate client, but the supply chain, right? So what are the sectors, what are the companies, what are the business models that are going to benefit from that mega trend? And then are they priced correctly or not? Because at the end of the day, if that's priced already, you're not interested. But if they are mispriced, so if the market hasn't yet identified that growth opportunity, then obviously that could be a financial opportunity for a growth fund, for example. So I think I'll wrap there. Thank you very much again, everyone.